Well, good morning. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I hope this will be an acceptable substitute. I want to emphasize right at the beginning that what follows is my sort of speculations, based upon what I believe to be the truth concerning the soul, but I'm not trying to define something. I'm just putting forward some ideas that Shirley and I have found useful and helpful, comforting even, and I hope that you will find them the same. So my sermon today is called The Soul Cloud. And my scripture reading is from Philippians, just a single verse. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And I hope you'll see the significance of that by the end of the sermon. And for the children's story, I want to tell you about Albert Einstein, the famous scientist. And he was so busy thinking about great things and the problems of relativity and so on that, yeah, sometimes he could be a little bit absent-minded. And the story is told that he had to attend a conference somewhere or other, and so he went down to the train station, got on board a train, which in those days was the default method of transport, and after the usual delay, the train started. Everyone sat back in their seats and prepared to endure the journey. And the conductor came round, asking for tickets, as conductors do. And Einstein searched everywhere, in all his pockets and his briefcase. He just looked everywhere. He could not find his ticket. And the conductor said, "Oh, it's all right, Professor Einstein. We all know who you are. Don't worry about it." And went on his way, checked the other passengers, and then moved on to the next carriage. Just as he was leaving the carriage, he looked back, and there was Einstein down on his hands and knees, searching under his seat. And the conductor rushed back and said, "Professor, we all know who you are. There's no need to worry about the ticket." And Einstein looked up at him and said, "Yeah, I also know who I am, but I need to know where I am going." We all may know who we are, but the important question in life is, do we know where we're going? Think on that. The soul cloud. Now, in a previous sermon, I drew a comparison between us as humans and a computer. The computer has hardware, we have a body. The big difference is, unless for a Hollywood starlet, the human body doesn't have all that much silicon in it. Think about it. But the hardware on its own is just a lump of plastic and metal. It's no use at all unless you can plug it into the mains and get some power into it. And in the same way, a human body without the life force, which the Bible calls the breath. In Greek the word is pneuma, from which we get pneumatic drills. So unless the body has breath, it's not much use. So body plus breath is similar to the hardware plus the power. But even that isn't all that much use unless you have the programs to make that computer do something useful. And of course everyone has their own individual suite of programs on their computer, their own desktop pictures and all the rest of it. And I liken that to our personality. The Greek word for soul is psyche, from which we get words like psychology, so psychiatry. So body plus breath plus personality all together make up the complete human being. Now the Bible tells us that when we die, the dust returns to the ground, the body returns to the ground, the hardware crumbles away, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. And the Hebrew word is ruach, a word which means personality. Now, what returns to God? Something does, but it obviously isn't the body, and I can't see any significance in returning the power supply to God. No, what goes back to God is the personality. And I have likened that to, at the moment of death, taking a snapshot, just as happens when you close the lid on your laptop computer. A snapshot shop is saved. And you could, in theory, take that snapshot, put it on a memory stick, insert it into another computer, and it would be just the same as the computer you had before. So everything, your genes, your life experiences, your knowledge, the whole lot. But now I would like to take that idea just a little step further. Let's start off with the fact that you were born. And of course you were a little infant. You weren't able to do much. You lay on your back, you gurgled, you cried, you waved your arms around, and you waited to be fed and changed. Then of course you grew into a toddler. Were you the same person as that infant? I'm sure you would have no difficulty in agreeing that yes, that little helpless baby is the same person as that toddler that's running around the place screaming. Okay? And then you get to be a teenager, and you're bigger and you're stronger, you're better educated, you can feed yourself and change yourself. Are you still the same person as that toddler, as that infant? Well, the answer is obvious. And then time passes. You have your own family, you get married, you have your own household, you have children of your own, and finally the time comes when you retire and your hair goes grey and all the rest of it. Are you still the same person? You may be better educated, you may have a few more life experiences under your belt, but are you the same person? Well, of course we would all say yes. It goes without saying. But that brings us to the question. What is it that ensures you are the same person? Is it your brain? Well, we know that as you grow, your brain cells increase during childhood. They're pruned away during your teenage years, which is one reason why teenagers are so difficult to get on with. They increase slightly in your adulthood, and then from about the age of 25 on, you go into a slow decline in numbers, until you get to grand old ages such as mine when you're practically gaga, you know. So which particular brain cell or clump of brain cells is the real you? And what happens if that little clump of brain cells is affected by a stroke or something and isn't there anymore? Well, people say that your frontal lobes are where your personality resides, where your character resides. Well, this is a picture of a chap in Ireland who complained of a headache, went along to his doctor, had a scan taken of his head, and was discovered that he had a tumor in his sinuses at the top of his nose, and that somehow resulted in a large empty space at the front of his head. Now this is looking down on the front of his head. His frontal lobes are very badly affected. But this man, his personality appeared just fine. He had a tendency to stumble and fall, but his personality was just fine. So if it isn't the brain, and I could give other examples of people who've had lobotomies, for example, and the front part of their brain will be completely separated from the rest of them, and yet they're still the same person. They're still, this little personality is still there. So what other part could be you, your personality, yourself? Well, I don't think we would say that it was your fingers or your toes or anything. Because you can lose a whole limb in an accident, and you're still you. You can have a different heart transplanted into you, and you're still you. So what is it that is the real you? Well, I would like to suggest that your identity resides not in any part of your body, but in something outside your body, in the human soul, that mysterious personality, which I have likened to a memory stick that contains a snapshot of the real you. Now remember, I'm not trying to define something, I'm just using analogies. But that idea is all very well for someone like you and me, you know. But what about a child who is born with a mental disability of some sort? Do they have a soul? Is it a crippled soul? can it ever fully develop? Or what about someone who is born completely normal, but then over time they develop something like Alzheimer's, dementia? And I've known people to say, oh, he's not the person he was. His personality is completely different. Well, is he completely different? Or is he the same person? There are some people who, when they have these personality changes, they become, well, they become very irascible. Have they lost their salvation because they've got a mental problem, their brain is declining? Well, to try and answer that question, I'd like to introduce you to this chap. He looks a bit like a tramp, but he is in fact a highly respected researcher in the field of human consciousness. His name is Dr. Benjamin Libbett. Back in the 1970s, he conducted an experiment that gave him entirely unexpected results. What he did was, he wired you up to a number of electrodes around your head, and then he asked you to look at a clock, and there was a button that you could press. And he said, now I want you to look at the clock, note the exact time at which you decide to press the button, and then we're going to measure the delay between your decision and the action of your finger when you press that button. So various people took part in the experiment, and on the whole, on average, you made the decision 200 milliseconds, that's 0.2 of a second, before your finger actually pushed the button. Well, that's obvious, you know, that's what you would expect. You make the decision, your finger acts. There's 0.2 of a second in between, great, fine. But then, that's where these electrodes wired up all around the head came into play. He looked at the person's brain waves. And there's a particular area of the brain that is called the motor cortex. And he discovered that 500 milliseconds, that's a whole half a second, before you pushed the button, there was a spike in the motor cortex indicating that your brain had sent a message to your finger saying, push the button. Half a second. In other words, 0.3 of a second before you decided to move your finger, your brain had already instructed your finger to move. That sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? You see, we would expect that the person decides to move his finger. That decision, which is taken in the brain, isn't it, instructs the finger to move, and then the finger presses the button. But what Libbett found was that the brain instructs the finger to move. 0.3 of a second later, the person decides to move his finger, and 0.2 of a second after that, a whole half a second after the brain had that tweak in the motor cortex, the finger pushes a button. Now, that's odd, isn't it? But in case you think there's some error, they've done the experiment again, using very sophisticated equipment that can get down almost to the level of single neurons. And the result has been the same. The brain instructs the finger to move before you decide to move the finger. In fact, under some circumstances, the brain sends that signal to the finger a whole 2 seconds before you make the decision. Which of course has fueled the debate about free will. You know, you're walking down the supermarket aisle and you decide that you need to get some milk. And up to 2 seconds before you make that decision, your brain has instructed your hand to reach out and start grabbing the milk off the shelf. That just doesn't sound likely, does it? Now, determinists, people who say that there's no such thing as free will, they think your idea that you have free will, it's just an illusion. Your decisions are simply the result of electrical activity in the brain, a brainstorm going on, you know. You don't have any choice in what you do. The trouble is that if you go for that, then it would absolve criminals of all responsibility. This chap, Justin Burka, shot 3 policemen dead in Canada. And if he was able to say, oh, well, you know, I didn't consciously choose to do it, it was my brain that made me do it. Well, I don't think the courts or society would accept that excuse. The guy's in prison, for all I know, he's on death row. Deservedly so, but, you know, we would not accept the idea that when you do something wrong, it is not your fault. But then Libbett did another experiment. He studied people who are undergoing awake brain surgery. Now, this is a common tactic used to try and make sure that when you're doing surgery on the brain, say for a brain cancer, you don't cut out something which is vital to the person's functioning. Now, he discovered that when he gave someone a brief shock on the skin, any part of the skin, the person reported an almost immediate sensation. You know, you give the shock and instantly the person says, ouch. All right? Well, here's someone who's awake, their head is open, their brain is exposed, and he gives a shock to a part of the brain. Now, scientists have a pretty good idea which part of your brain corresponds to your hand, which part to your foot, and so on. So he gives a stimulus to the exact same part, say a finger, where you had said, ouch, immediately, and nothing happened. A whole half second went by before the person became aware that he was receiving a shock. Do it to your finger, instant. Do it to the finger section of your brain, no, nothing, for half a second. In fact, I think the experiment was that the shock had to continue for half a second before you became aware of it. Now, again, he used all this equipment on the head, an EEG, to check what was going on, and he found that there was brain activity within 20 milliseconds of stimulating the brain directly. That is 0.002, but the person, the conscious person, did not become aware of the shock until half a second after the shock was given. And that, I think, is the clue to what's going on. We could imagine that we have this setup. You have a computer, you have a row of LEDs, you have a screen, and you have a remote control. Okay, and you want to turn one of the LEDs on, and you want the screen to display a message saying LED number 3 is on, or whatever. So you press a button on the remote control, and the signal gets sent to the computer. Now, for the computer to turn on an LED, it is quite simply just, you know, flicks a relay, and so almost immediately the LED turns on. But before it can display a message, it has to do a lot of thinking. It has to decide what language to use. It searches in a dictionary for the words, how they're spelt. It checks the grammar. It chooses the font or the font size and the color and so on. And finally, it displays a message on the screen. Now, obviously, I haven't done this experiment, but there would be a delay, a measurable delay, between you pushing the button and the message coming on screen. But the delay would be much shorter for the actual LED to come on. So, let's suppose that we have an alternative model. Let's suppose that the decision to push that button doesn't take place in your brain. It takes place somewhere else, somewhere outside you. And like that electric shock, the signal is transmitted to your brain. The brain then has to process it and do whatever is necessary. So it takes 20 milliseconds for the signal to reach the brain and the brain to start to react. It takes 500 milliseconds for the whole complicated business of your consciousness becoming aware of it. But for actually tweaking your finger on the button, it only takes 200 milliseconds. hence a 300 millisecond delay. Alright? Now, these days, we're used to the idea of cloud computing. We're used, or old-fashioned people like me, we're used to the idea that everything is held in the computer itself. There in that box on the screen, you have a hard drive. On that hard drive is all the programs you need, is all the data you have accumulated, your pictures and your music and whatever. It's all there in the computer. But these days, trendy people like my son Richard, they use what's called cloud computing. Now, I do a certain amount of video editing, and recently Adobe, who produced the program I use, decided that they would no longer sell my program. Instead, it would be held on their servers, and I could rent it for some exorbitant sum every month. Yeah, well. But the result is that you can use their service even if you are only using something like a dumb terminal or a tablet. If you have an iPad, you can do all sorts of things. You can watch DVD quality movies and edit your photos and check your emails and so on. If you only have a phone, an iPhone, well, you can still check your emails. That doesn't take much processing power, but you can't watch DVDs. You can't edit your photographs. The screen isn't big enough. The processor isn't powerful enough. Right? That can be terribly frustrating if you're wanting to do something like that, and people do edit video on their mobile phones. Why you do something so masochistic, I cannot imagine. But I can imagine it must be a very frustrating experience because it's so slow. And some of the facilities that you would have on a real computer are just not available on your phone. But you can send your data up to a big server farm, the cloud, that hosts the program that will host your data. The programs are stored up there. Up there they are processed, and then the finished result is sent down to you and displayed on your iPhone. But there's a short delay while the data goes back and forth from your phone to the cloud, from the cloud to your phone. Now, what would happen if something went wrong with your phone? You dropped it, say, and all of a sudden your screen will only display magenta. You take a picture, you got a magenta sky with magenta clouds, with magenta grass, with magenta girlfriend sitting in the foreground. Yeah. But you send it up to the cloud, you apply the usual filters, the picture comes back, all you can see is magenta, but it has been processed in the cloud. And eventually you get your phone repaired, or you buy a new one, and you can download the picture, and it is just perfect. It's exactly what you expected it to be, because what is going on the local processor doesn't affect what is going on up in the cloud. Now, let's think of that in terms of people. Here we have a young woman, everything is working fine. The back and forth between her soul in the cloud, what I'm calling the cloud, and her brain, it's all just happening. She doesn't even notice it. And then the years pass, and she starts to get a bit creaky. The old memory isn't quite what it used to be. She has trouble finding words, but on the whole, things are going back and forth. Yeah, everything's fine. And then comes a stroke. And suddenly, everything can go up to the cloud, but coming back down, there's a problem. But the point I want to make is that up on the cloud, everything is hunky-dory, everything is fine. What is happening down below? She may be seeing everything in magenta, she may be seeing red. But what is happening up in her soul is just fine. And then, of course, someone has an accident and there's nothing going in either direction. But the real person, the personality, it's all there. It's safe. It's kept safe. And that, I think, is why it's so important what Solomon said. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. while the connections are fine, while everything's working fine, before the days of trouble come, before that connection gets a bit slow, or is even broken completely. Now, of course, you're going to say, hang on, there's just a problem. If this cloud exists, you know, it'll be up in heaven. Heaven's too far away. I mean, it takes 1.3 seconds for light from the moon to reach us, 8 minutes for light from the sun to reach us. From the far side of the Milky Way, it takes 52,000 years for light to reach us. So, you know, you're talking nonsense. Well, there is an answer. It's called quantum entanglement. And if you haven't heard of it before, you might find it interesting to look it up on the internet. It enables particles to affect each other instantaneously across any distance. And scientists have, you know, measured this as far apart as they can. And what you do to one particle instantly happens to the other. And the scientists don't like it. I think it was Einstein who said, no, it can't be true. That's spooky action at a distance. He wouldn't have a bar of it. But the more scientists have studied it, the more they've found you can't shake it. It actually is happening. And modern scientists call it science's strangest phenomenon. They hate it, but the experimental evidence is there and it's just too strong. So how does God up in heaven know from moment to moment how many hairs you have on your head? How does he know when to send help when you're being tempted? Perhaps up in heaven there's an entangled you, which God can observe and instantly know all about you down here on this earth. So, you know, that may be the real you, the soul that's entangled. But when you make a decision up there, the server farm, the cloud, it takes 20 milliseconds for that decision to reach your brain. And then it takes longer for the message to be passed to your muscles and to your consciousness. Now, you may be allergic, as I am, to the word soul, or the idea that there's a soul up there that controls everything we do. Well, here's another concept, and that is a mirror. Now, if you've ever run a website, you will know the advantage of having a mirror. And I keep a mirror of my websites on my hard drive. If anything goes wrong with the website, I simply reload it from the mirror. The mirror is an exact replicate of what is up on the internet. Now, for example, when I was with a previous internet provider, several times I had occasion to look at my website on the internet, and I discovered there are a whole lot of very odd files. I don't know how they sneaked past the ISP's protection, but virus checkers and all, but it had. Now, I had the option of going through each one of those files, downloading it, checking it, loading it back up again. Oh, blow that. I just deleted the whole site and re-uploaded it from the mirror. Okay? Is it too fanciful to think that God might be maintaining a mirror of every one of us, for every one of us? If it's to be an accurate mirror, it must keep a record of every decision we take, every action we take, every word that we hear or say. And you know what? There are computers doing that right now. Probably your phone is at this very moment listening to me preach. It's keeping track of where we've been, when we've been there, who we phoned. And even after COVID-19, if you've got the tracker app on, who you encountered in the street and when and for how long. Does that sound a little bit like the books of record that we believe God is keeping up in heaven, in which every word and deed is recorded? If Google and Apple can do it with Alexa and Siri and Cortana and all the rest of it, and if the evidence these things collect can already be used in the courts as evidence against you, why can't God do it? So what is the soul? Well, really, it's another term for your personality. The sum total of all your knowledge, your responses, your instincts, your attitudes. What makes you you, and which differentiates you from your identical twin, if you like. Now, the psychologists believe that by and large your personality, your soul, is something you're born with. It's built into you. Even from a baby, they can tell whether you're likely to be bold or shy, outgoing, extrovert or introvert, all that sort of thing. And because it's built into you, it's hard to change. You can change it. Certainly I believe you can. But it's difficult to do so. You can't change your personality just overnight. But there is another thing, and that is that your personality is affected by what you do in your body. If you take drugs, you're going to wreck your personality. So we need to take care of our bodies, and particularly we need to take care of our brains. Don't do drugs. Drugs are bad for your body, they're bad for your soul as well. Anything that impairs your brain. The second thing is that we do need to be careful what goes into our brains, because what goes in ends up being part of us, being part of our soul, part of our personality. Well, fortunately, God has given us filters. They're called ears and eyes. And that's why Paul said, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, if it's excellent or praiseworthy, think about those things. We are to consciously fill our minds with what is good and clean. But perhaps another reason why it's hard to change our personalities is that we need to have the cooperation of the webmaster, the one who maintains the mirror, so that changes are not simply overwritten as hacks. That's why if we want to change our minds, our personalities, we can't do it on our own. We need God's help to do it. And that is why Scripture says, we, as we behold the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord. If we make God the center of our thoughts, we are transformed, we are changed into his likeness. We don't lose what we are, we become the perfect version of ourselves. So when people suffer from Alzheimer's or dementia or have an accident or a stroke, their personalities can change. Someone who was normally meek, butter wouldn't melt in their mouth, that wouldn't hurt a fly, can become violent and aggressive. And often that's born out of frustration because they know that they can't do the things they used to do. I had a friend in Hridlan, very nice lady, very nice husband. But one day I saw her and she had a black eye. I said, what did you do to yourself? And she said, oh, my husband hit me. What? And it turned out that he was increasingly suffering from dementia, probably Alzheimer's. And when he tried to boil a kettle to make himself a cup of tea, something he's done, all through his life, he couldn't remember how to do it. And then she came along and offered to help, and he lashed out at her, completely unlike his normal self. Does that mean that he, because he's bad-tempered, because he's aggressive, he's no longer a Christian? No, I don't think so. I would say that the real him, the one that he had developed over all the years, it was safe up in the cloud, and the webmaster was filtering out the results of damage. All his memories, his abilities, his friendly, peaceful personality was kept safe, ready for the glorious day when he gets a new body, and that perfect personality is put back in, or is back in control of his body. The true personalities will be brought by Jesus and reinstalled. We believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. Bring with them? Yes. Brings the souls, brings the personalities, brings those memory sticks, and reinstalls them in the brand new computers that we will get in the day of resurrection. So let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for the wonderfully complex way that we are. We don't understand it all, but we trust in Thee to preserve us and keep us and restore us in the end. And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus, and the close friendship of the Holy Spirit be with us all till He come. Amen.